I've had a long experience of the elite media, and it's at some levels it's almost funny. The recent series of attacks on me are just part of a very long tradition. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution once spent 23 days attacking me every single day because they thought they had a chance to beat me. And so I was either in an editorial cartoon, an editorial, or a news story, literally for 23 straight days in the Atlanta Constitution, just trying to beat me. When we won the election in '94, which was a huge shock to the left, I mean, nobody on the left thought we could win. And, we had not won in 40 years, and they thought that they'd lose some seats, but after all, the unthinkable wouldn't occur. And unfortunately, in their minds, I was the unthinkable. A few weeks afterwards, before I was even sworn in as Speaker, Time magazine had me on their cover as Scrooge, holding Tiny Tim's broken crutch. And the title of the magazine that week was, "How Mean Will Gingrich's America Be to the Poor?" And I thought to myself, okay, I get that I'm Scrooge, but did I actually have to break his crutch? I wasn't stealing the crutch enough. But the Time magazine people pointed out that since it was a question, it wasn't really editorializing. The following week, Newsweek caught up by having me as a Dr. Seuss figure, and the title of the cover of Newsweek that week was "The Grinch That Stole Christmas." Now, what was fascinating to me was the average American seeing these two covers did not get the reaction that the elite media expected. They didn't go, "Oh, he's going to be a terrible, mean person." They said, "Oh, he wants to reform welfare." And they agreed that welfare should be reformed. So all the magazine covers did was actually bring to the attention of the American people we were trying to reform welfare. And most Americans did not think requiring people to work was mean. They thought, in fact, it was the first step towards their working their way out of poverty, and they thought getting people to go to work or to get to school was actually an advantage, not a disadvantage. And so, as a result, when we finally passed welfare reform after 2 years of debate, it was vetoed twice by President Clinton. He signed it the third time. By the time we passed it the third time, 92% of the American people favored welfare reform because we'd won the argument. And people said, yeah, that's right. And we got half the Democratic Party to vote with us. In the House, it was 101 to 101. So I do think it's interesting to watch sort of the caricatures. It's amazing how if you're a good liberal, you get the smiling face. And if you're a solid conservative, you get the scrunched up face. And I will plead guilty to being a conservative, so don't expect in the near future to have the New York Times do a flattering portrait of me. But it also brings, I think, the key challenge we have as a country right now, and the challenge all of you have in your hometowns. Getting real change is a very hard, painful process. I mean, any of you who've been involved in running a co-op and have had to make tough decisions about personnel or tough decisions about major strategies and major policies know that you can get in very intense arguments. You can make decisions that you hope are right, but you have no proof of going in. You sometimes make decisions that require you to dismiss people that you really thought were pretty good but didn't quite fit that particular job. Well, now take this to 305 million people in a country that's in deep trouble. And one of the challenges in Washington, I think, is for the political leadership to relax and slow down and understand. For this country to successfully solve its problems, we're going to have some very major fights. Because you're not going to get the people who currently are in charge to give up power cheerfully. They are doing what they're doing because they believe in it. It represents their interest groups. It represents their ideology. It is what they want to do. And so part of the real challenge, and you're seeing this over the debt ceiling, is, yes, this is going to be a period of tension. It's going to be a period of confrontation. And if it isn't, that will mean that we have sold out and that the old order is going to continue to run us into debt, and the old order is going to continue to build bureaucracies. And that's a very key part of where we are right now. So let me talk briefly about where America is, then I want to toss it open and take questions from you. But I want to set a stage of how serious this is. I believe if you were to just sit down with a piece of paper and list every challenge that you know we face. We have a huge deficit, which means the Chinese are buying more and more of our debt and therefore gaining more and more control over our financial future. We have a real danger of inflation because of the size of our deficits. We have a declining manufacturing base, which means that we face a very real challenge from China and may literally in 20 or 30 years not be in a position to compete effectively. And that means we wouldn't be in a position to sustain our national security. We are faced with I think, a huge strategic deficit in the Middle East where our elites don't understand the scale of the problem, don't understand the people who are trying to kill us, and frankly, it's a much bigger, much harder, much longer-term problem than we're prepared for right now. We have schools that don't succeed. We have entire neighborhoods that no longer have a habit of work. And these are real crises because America only works when America is working. If you look at last Friday's numbers, 9.2% unemployment understated how bad the problem is. We actually had 250,000 people drop out during the month of June. They're not looking for work. So in a shrinking pool of people, unemployment went up. Now that's doubly frightening. I mean, if the number of people looking for work is now the lowest number since 1984 as a percent of the workforce, and you still have a rising unemployment number, we have a big challenge. When you take unemployment, underemployment, and people who dropped out and add them up, was called a U6 number, it was 16.2% of the country. That's 1 out of every 6 Americans. If you take the number of people who are now on food stamps, it's almost 1 out of every 6 Americans. And those are signals that the system's not working. We want to be a country of paychecks, not a country of food stamps. And I think my central message is really simple. It's as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. You know, there are truths that you can't hide from. And one of our challenges as a country is to have a national conversation based on truths. There are ways you create jobs and there are ways you kill jobs. Regulation, litigation, high taxes, all kill jobs. Entrepreneurship, lower taxes, encouraging people to invest, encouraging the work ethic, create jobs. Now, this is not magic. Ronald Reagan got elected at a time of very high unemployment, the worst recession since the Great Depression, up until now. We've now passed this. This is now worse than the last 2 years of Carter. But up until now, it was the worst period since the Great Depression. It had 13% inflation and 21% interest rates. And Reagan entered office and within days began to turn it around by simply methodically applying the equivalent of 2 + 2 = 4. How do you encourage investment? How do you encourage job creation? So take, for example, 2 recent cases. When the President imposed a moratorium in the Gulf, I think the White House didn't realize that large drilling rigs can move. And they thought they could play games with them politically and they'd have to sit there. But of course, these huge, very expensive rigs can be shipped all over the world. And so they began leaving. And the second rig to leave was owned by a small entrepreneurial company whose CEO was very aggressive. And he issued the following press release. Because of political instability, we are leaving the United States and will now be drilling off of the Congo. Now, I bet none of you in your lifetime expected us to be compared unfavorably to a third world country. But he was saying that the U.S. government was now so totally unreliable that he wasn't going to risk his capital. So he's taking $80,000 a year jobs out of Louisiana. He's taking all the royalties they would have paid to the U.S. government for the oil and gas they produced. And he's now moving to a foreign country because he so deeply distrusts the American government. You saw this happen with the EPA last week. In the middle of a deep depression, and this is a depression, at 9.2% unemployment, with a shrinking workforce, with housing values dropping by more than they did in the Great Depression. At this point, you have the EPA issuing rules that are totally destructive and that indicate that none of the bureaucrats at EPA make any investment decisions. They have no idea of the length of time it takes to turn around the electric infrastructure of this country. And so they wave magic wands and they say, oh, well, we can fix this in 5 years. Well, none of them are manufacturers. None of them are managers. None of them have been in the private sector. They're just bureaucrats. And the amount they're going to add in cost, you know better than I do. And what that's going to do is both lower the standard of living for the American people and kill more jobs. I mean, in Ohio, I was told by a number of small manufacturers, the price of electricity is the #1 factor in whether they go to China. Not the price of labor, the price of electricity. And that they regard the EPA as a major job-killing institution. So I think we're at a point where we're going to have a serious national conversation, and it's actually pretty straightforward. If we remain a centralized, bureaucratic, high-tax system, we are going to decay. We are going to give our children a country which is poorer, weaker, less safe, and ultimately less free. If we go back to basic American principles, we will become extraordinarily successful. When Reagan instituted his changes, if you lay the Reagan Recovery, which started in October of 1982, if you take the first 7 years of the Reagan Recovery and put it over the current size of our economy and the current size of our population, it would add 25 million new jobs, $4.4 trillion a year of economic activity, and $800 billion a year of higher federal revenue by the end of the 7th year. Now, I mean, that's a historic fact. This is not some theoretical model. We know that when you liberate entrepreneurs, when you have the right tax code, when you have the right regulatory reform, you just have an explosion of American energy. So I'll give you a very brief example of an outline of how to think about this. And it all relates very directly to whether or not you can, in fact, serve your customers and work with the members of your co-op and provide them both an opportunity to create jobs and an opportunity to have a decent standard of living. And you can take one of the examples, which is a project you're working on, which is having an ability to enable people over time to insulate their homes so that they lower the cost of the amount of electricity they're using in a way that clearly over a 10 or 20-year period saves an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of investment in additional generating power. Now, if you do it on a 2 + 2 = 4 model, you can make this work. And it actually is a win-win. It's better for the environment, it's better for the economy, it's better for the standard of living of your members. If you do it badly, it's a lose-lose. You won't be able to afford it, your members won't be able to afford it, and the system won't work. And so being able to manage these projects is a big deal. Being able to apply common sense is a big deal. Being able to use math to know whether or not something's real is a big deal. The people who developed Lean Six Sigma, a management system, have founded an organization called Strong America Now. And they got something like 17,000 members in Iowa. I mean, this tells you how bad things are. When you can recruit citizens to be in favor of applying Lean Six Sigma to the federal government, that means that they are so worried that they're willing to learn things nobody ever thought an American citizen would learn. They believe they could save $500 billion a year by applying sound management to the federal government. I think the actual results are unknowable because take the example of the home investment insulation program. Done correctly over a 20 or 30-year period, the amount you will save in South Carolina is extraordinary. And yet it doesn't show up. There's no kind of scoring at EPA. There's no kind of scoring at the Congressional Budget Office that takes into account the total quality of life of the people of South Carolina. And that looks at this as a positive alternative model that is much better than the EPA regulatory model. So let me suggest to you, first of all, we need to replace the Environmental Protection Agency with an environmental solutions agency of new people based on a totally new model which uses science and technology and incentives and entrepreneurship rather than regulation and litigation, and which sets out to find ways to invest in a better future rather than to regulate people into bankruptcy. And I think that this will be one of the major issues next year because as jobs keep getting killed, people are going to be less and less tolerant of radical bureaucrats imposing destructive policies from Washington on the whole country. And everywhere I go, fixing the EPA and replacing it with an environmental solutions agency gets a good hearing. It's as big an issue in Iowa as it is here in a totally different way because EPA is as destructive on the farm as they are with electricity. But think about the scale of change I just described. If you actually went in tomorrow morning and you replaced the Environmental Protection Agency with an Environmental Solutions Agency, that would be an enormous wrenching change. And you'd have a very big fight with the old order in getting it done. So how would you get this economy? Assume you could run a referendum in 2012 on whether you prefer paychecks or food stamps, whether you want the economy to grow or you're willing to accept 4 more years of decay. How would you actually do it? What would you offer the American people? I think it comes to taxes, regulations, and an American energy policy. So let me give you three quick zones. In taxes, I think we should first of all say no tax increase of any kind in 2013, because if you're in the middle of a deep depression, you don't want to drive us deeper by raising taxes. So taxing the very people who create jobs is a bad idea. Second, we ought to go to zero capital gains as the rate for the capital gains tax, because if we had a zero capital gains rate, you'd have hundreds of billions of dollars pouring into this country to create new factories, create new businesses, create new jobs, and we would become the best place in the world to invest. And people wouldn't have to worry about companies leaving the U.S. You wouldn't have the New York Stock Exchange listing in Holland, which it did this year. You'd have companies coming back to the U.S. to say, how do I create jobs here, because this would be the most profitable place in the world to invest. Third, you ought to go to a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which has two benefits, both of them, ironically, things liberals claim they want. At 12.5%, you would get more tax money out of General Electric than you currently get at 35%. Because at 35%, General Electric hires enough tax lawyers to not pay anything. But at 12.5%, it would be cheaper to fire half the lawyers and actually write a check to the government. And so you'd actually increase the payment from large corporations by lowering the rate to an amount they're willing to pay. There's also about $1 trillion in profits that are locked up overseas because no rational company is going to bring them back home at a 35% rate. At 12.5%, a very high percentage of that will come back home and either be distributed as dividends to increase the income of people or will be invested in the United States to create new jobs. So you have a win-win at 12.5%. The fourth thing I would do is go to 100% expensing. This relates directly to what you all do. I would allow every company, every farmer, every doctor, every hospital to write off 100% of all new equipment in 1 year. And what that does is it creates an enormous incentive for American workers to have the newest equipment in the world, to be the most productive in the world, and to be capable of competing with anybody. And it really rebuilds our industrial base very rapidly and enables us to compete head-to-head with China and India and in a way that would be very, very profitable for us and would rebuild our national security base by rebuilding our industrial base. Finally, I would permanently abolish the death tax because it is a fundamentally immoral tax culturally. It is wrong to say to somebody you have to visit the IRS and the undertaker in the same week. And it's wrong to say to somebody, if you do everything right your whole life, if you work hard, you save, you do all the things that are the right thing, a politician can now reach in your pocket and take half your money when you die. And it just strikes me that's fundamentally wrong. We want families that are successful to be growing new jobs and growing a bigger company, not spending the last 20 years of their career with a tax lawyer trying to figure out how to get out of paying the federal government. On regulation, a couple straightforward things. We should immediately, I mean this week or next week, but we should immediately repeal the Dodd-Frank Bill. It is a terrible bill. Every Republican in the House voted against it last year. It is devastating to small banks because it puts such a huge regulatory burden on them, and it gives the big banks a competitive advantage of government guarantee. It is devastating to small business because it means there are fewer and fewer small banks to borrow from. It further depresses the price of housing at a time when it's already deeper than it was in the Great Depression. And it centralizes in the U.S. Treasury a guarantee of corruption, because the U.S. Treasury will have a panel which can micromanage every big bank in the United States. Now, it's inconceivable that you could have that level of political power sitting in the Treasury Department without massive corruption. And so this is a bill that we ought to repeal immediately. It would overnight improve the lives of every small bank in the country. They would increase the number of loans they make to small businesses. We would be back on a road as a starting point. We should also repeal Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a bill which has crippled new companies, crippled small and medium-sized public companies, driven companies to go private, and which has produced no positive results. We have no evidence in 2008 during the crisis of any information from Sarbanes-Oxley being helpful to anybody. In addition, as I said a while ago, we should replace the Environmental Protection Agency with an Environmental Solutions Agency. And we should modernize the Food and Drug Administration and create a 21st century FDA. The largest number of new jobs in the world market are going to be in health. As countries get wealthier, they're going to buy more medicine, they're going to buy more medical devices, they're going to buy more capability. And the United States has the potential to lead the world in market share and to have high value-added jobs in the health field. And if you were to go to the Medical College of South Carolina, you'd be shocked at the number of things being developed that are amazing. I recently talked with a doctor at Wake Forest who's developing regenerative medicine, who can do an amazing range of things that will enable you to, in the next few years, we'll be able to avoid kidney dialysis by just literally giving you back your own kidney cells in a way that I think is almost magic. You talk to people in the brain science field, we're on the verge of enormous breakthroughs which affect Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the largest single health cost in the next 40 years. Between now and 2050, we will spend $20 trillion on Alzheimer's. That's 1.5 federal debts. And if we got the right kind of breakthrough, if you postpone Alzheimer's by 5 years, because it's a disease of the elderly, you cut the cost in half, and you make lives dramatically better. And so all these things are possible, but today's Food and Drug Administration actually stops them from happening. And so you need to modernize the Food and Drug Administration in order to be able to bring new products to market, in order to have them made in the United States, in order to create jobs. So it's a terrific potential to give you longer life with greater independence, with better health, at lower cost because the health system becomes less expensive, and to do it in a way which creates millions of American jobs that are all high-quality, high-paying jobs. It's a fundamentally different approach than what we're doing in Washington today. Let me say, finally, we need an American energy policy. And this is a place where the president's frankly just completely wrong. He went to Brazil recently and he said he was proud that they were drilling offshore. He was proud that we'd been able to guarantee $2 billion in loan guarantees for them to buy equipment, largely for a company owned by George Soros. And he then went on to say, we want to be your best customer. That's exactly backwards. You want the President of the United States not to be a purchasing agent going around the world telling other countries we'd like to buy from them. You'd like the President of the United States to go around the world as a salesman, telling other countries what they should be buying from the U.S. And you can't have an economic policy which borrows from China to pay Brazil. And you've got to have a policy that encourages the American economy and the growth of the American economy. So I believe we have to reset our energy policy, starting with oil and gas offshore. And again, you've got natural gas deposits right off South Carolina. You could have an entire industry right now, high-value jobs, both onshore providing and supporting the natural gas and offshore developing. And you can move it far enough offshore. You can have ground rules so it doesn't affect tourism at all because you don't even see them. But the fact is, if you go to Louisiana and you look at how much better they were doing before the moratorium, you understand how really big a deal it is to be able to have that kind of infrastructure. Look at North Dakota, which has 3% unemployment because the Bakken shales turned out to be a huge reservoir of oil and gas. You look at Texas, which has brought in, I think in 2 of the last 4 years, half the private sector jobs in the U.S. were in Texas. And again, it's largely energy related. So for us not to be developing our energy resources is to cripple our economy and to weaken our national security. We kept $400 billion a year at home that we're currently sending overseas. We'd both be better off economically. We'd have a lot more American jobs. And we're better off not to prop up Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or Iraq or Iran. And so this includes, frankly, clean coal. I mean, we were told in 2003 the Department of Energy by 2008 would have a clean coal plant up and running. We're now told that the bureaucracy might have one up and running by 2016. The odds are that the Chinese will build a clean coal plant faster than we do. Just as in NASA, we now are relying on a Russian rocket to get to the space station because our bureaucracy literally couldn't build a taxi. This is a country that went to the moon in 7 years. And we now can't figure out how to build a space taxi to get to the space station. And it's watching the bureaucracies grind down. So you've got to have, I think you've got to have a policy that says we're going to fundamentally change Washington by offering the American people a vivid choice. And if you offer them a clear, I believe, just as Reagan did in 1980, just as we did in 1994 with the contract, if you offer a clear enough choice between more energy, more jobs, more prosperity, more national security, more dependence on foreigners, more food stamps, more unemployment, and more weakness. That choice is so big and vivid that you could have one of the most important elections in American history next year, really creating for the American people a dialogue about the very future of this country and what kind of country we ought to be. So I'd like to, if I could, just toss it open for questions.
Great. Let me ask you one question, if I could. First, in the breakfast this morning, I asked you about your co-op background, and you talked about going to co-op annual meetings in Georgia. campaigning there, eating a lot of barbecue there, I believe you said. Mm-hmm. And I asked you about the co-op business model and us being nonprofits. And you gave one of the most interesting analogies I've ever heard a co-op compared to, and that was about the migration out west. Would you mind at least repeating that for the folks here?
Now, this partially came from my childhood. I was born in Harrisburg. My dad was a career soldier. I ended up in Georgia at Fort Benning. And growing up in the Harrisburg area, we had a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch and a lot of Amish. And if you watch the Amish, when the time comes to raise a barn, they don't go to the government for a loan. They get all the folks in the neighborhood together, and they spend a day having a barn raising. And they bring food, and they raise the barn together as a collective effort. They have a great event. I have a hunch that an awful lot of Amish marriages start with boys and girls meeting each other over food after the barn raising. Well, the same thing was true in the West. And this is one of the things we don't teach very well, and it's something you have to help your members understand. You can portray the West as mountain men who went out by themselves in order to hunt beaver pelts, which was certainly true in the early days. But that wasn't the primary migration. The primary migration were people who voluntarily got together to form wagon trains. Now notice the distinction. We didn't create a federal department of wagon trains. We didn't have bureaucrats who certified that you were acceptable as a wagoneer. We didn't have people who said, yes, you now know enough to go west. We didn't have a grant program where you could apply for a government loan in order to go west. What we did do, though, is we voluntarily, spontaneously came together. And we said, 30, 40, 50 wagons are more likely to survive, helping each other if one of them breaks down, fighting off Indians if that happens, surviving a blizzard if that happens, than a single isolated wagon, which almost certainly would not make it across the Great Plains. And so we had this very deep voluntarism. I mean, any of you who belong to, I have a daughter who has rheumatoid arthritis, and she's on the Arthritis Foundation Board. It's a voluntary group that gets together because they care. I have another daughter who got involved in a housing project for battered spouses, and she helps raise money for it. And it's a voluntary project because she cares. She and her husband were also the chairs of the fundraising ball for the Botanical Society in Atlanta because they care. And so historically, this has been a country that said there are a lot of different ways to get jobs done. And one way is the private for-profit sector. Another is the not-for-profit sector. And a third is government. And each has its own value and its own use. And I would argue that actually what you want to do is shrink government and move back a lot of things back towards a much more voluntary, and churches and synagogues were also part of the voluntary system. So I saw co-ops when I first began running. We would go annually to a very large co-op get-together, which actually was barbecue chicken, and shake 5,000 hands and talk to people. But you really got this sense of why the co-op system worked. And of course, Georgia has a very rich co-op history. I represented at one time Barnesville, which is where Franklin Delano Roosevelt went in 1938 to turn on the electricity. I talked to folks, some of you may remember these stories, I talked to folks who remembered the light bulbs popping in Georgia when they turned on the electricity in rural Carroll County, and folks had bought very low watt bulbs that when they had their own generators on the farm, and when they got connected, if they hadn't changed the bulbs, the amount of electricity that came through the line would actually blow out the bulbs. And they said you could literally hear the bulbs popping all over the county on that particular day. And so when I first started serving in Georgia in the 70s, there were people around for whom the co-op movement literally had taken them out of the dark. And the sense of the passion they felt about what co-ops had meant for rural America was very real and very powerful. We have the same challenge now, not so much in a state this size, but when you go out west, when you go to Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and further west, if you have big enough rural areas right now, we have a problem with access to wireless that is very similar in a way to the 1920s with electricity and telephone. Because if you're in rural enough areas, you can't get enough broadband to be able to do all the things you want to do with computers. And it's a very interesting challenge about how do we get broadband to rural America as part of this whole process. And the co-op movement grew up trying to find models of getting services, both telephone and electricity, to places that weren't going to get it. I mean, it would have taken, there's some areas in the United States that today would still not be served commercially because it just wasn't profitable. And I respect the profit motive per se, but that also means, going back to 2 + 2 = 4, there are times you have to find other models that can also make sense, that can also work, and the co-op model has been one of those.